The pressure differential behind Renwick Halvor's eyes was approaching physical pain, the kind reserved for rapid decompression or high-G maneuvers. It was not the pressure of the tribunal room itself, polished synth steel and chilled air tasting of recycled ozone and old data conduits, but the internal compression of pure, unadulterated injustice. He could feel the fine sweat tracing paths beneath the stiff, high collar of his full-dress uniform, a mockery of authority in this environment of controlled administrative decay. 3 hours. 3 hours they had spent dissecting the 47 seconds of the Verlassung dry anomaly. They called it an anomaly, a critical data spike, a catastrophic local grid failure. They never once used the words hostile presence. The woman seated across the table, Sector Adjudicator Dernithar, was an alien, not biologically, but institutionally. Her skin was perfectly smooth, pale as filtered ice, and her expression was one of meticulous, unforgiving disappointment. Dernithar belonged to the Stellar Auditing Corps' internal affairs. The department Kalen Rourke had been excised from 6 cycles prior, and she carried the cold, sterile certainty that all problems were the result of human sloppiness, never systemic vulnerability. Commander Halvor, Dernithar stated, her voice a low, precisely modulated tone that defeated the room's ambient hum. Confirm your understanding of the findings of the Preliminary Fact-Finding Commission. The sudden, unauthorized routing of critical non-essential energy, a colossal power spike that disrupted standardized deep space monitoring, was a direct consequence of lax operational oversight within the Nomara security grid, specifically Subdivision Alpha 7, under your command. Renwick held his posture rigid. He inhaled the air, thick with the chemical scent of floor polish and the underlying metallic stink of aging machinery, fadiga industrial. He knew the cost of every word spoken here. Adjudicator, Renwick replied, his voice level, echoing the careful cadence he'd learned in 20 years of fleet service. The energy routing, while irregular, was executed by an outside operator, a civilian, using a deprecated public utility node, Relay 7 Beta. The primary failure was the intrusion, not the operational response. The intent of the intrusion is deemed irrelevant, Dernithar countered, her eyes like frozen pools behind the polarized visor of her rank helmet. Intent does not excuse outcome. That energy spike, regardless of its amateur origin, triggered a full-spectrum security cascade across 5 sectors. Our deep space monitoring assets recorded 0 signatures of hostile contact prior to the event. Therefore, the security breach occurred internally. Renwick tightened his jaw. The plastic shell of his seat creaked faintly, a small, pathetic noise of protest against the overwhelming institutional silence. He remembered Kalen's frantic, poorly formatted reports flooding the discarded terminals. He remembered the auditor's obsession with a perfect subtraction. The invisible fleet that moved with such flawless efficiency, it vanished beneath the noise of human error. Kalen had been right. The invasion wasn't coming. It was already here. And now, the CDA, unable to admit they were outflanked by administrative genius, was choosing the comfortable lie of incompetence. Adjudicator, Renwick pushed back, the muscle in his neck twitching with suppressed effort. The spike lasted 4.7 standard seconds. In those 4.7 seconds, 2 distinct security satellite arrays, Array Gamma and Array Pi, registered visual confirmations of geometric shadows above the Verlassung dry orbital plane. Geometric shadows consistent with heavy, cloaked warship architecture. Not random noise, not pirates. The visual logs were purged within the hour. A moment of pure, dangerous silence descended. Dernithar's visor did not move. The only sound was the distant high-pitched zumbido de alta voltagem of the station's power regulation systems, feeding Renwick's paranoia electrica. The visual artifacts, Dernithar finally stated, her tone now laced with controlled menace. are attributed to residual energy lensing caused by the unexpected power surge hitting the dark matter field stabilizers near Gamma Array. A technical error. The purge was necessary to avoid unauthorized data dissemination and prevent panic. Renwick felt the metallic taste of resignation flood his mouth. They had decided the narrative. The truth was now inconvenient. If the Zydran fleet was confirmed, the populace would panic, the markets would collapse, and the current political regime and the adjudicators would be accountable. It was easier to sacrifice one commander. So, to clarify, adjudicator, Renwick summarized, leaning slightly forward, meeting her synthetic gaze. We attribute the detection of a potential hostile invasion force to a random 300-year-old coffee dispenser relay being overloaded by a retired auditor with a grudge against improper logging protocol. And the subsequent failure to prevent this administrative anarchy is placed on my division. Durnathar shifted a single millimeter in her chair, a movement that conveyed galaxies of official disapproval. Commander Halvor, the Colonial Defense Authority must maintain the appearance of absolute control and flawless systemic integrity, even in the face of internal entropy. Your failure to integrate civilian oversight reports in a timely and professional manner allowed this event to proceed. Your command is hereby relieved of duty, pending full investigation. Relieved of duty, stripped, not executed, not imprisoned. Worse, stripped of the one thing that had defined his life since he was a cadet: purpose. Effective immediately, Durnathar continued, retrieving a thin data slate. Your record will reflect administrative misconduct leading to sector-wide energy instability. However, due to your 22 years of exemplary service, the CDA offers an alternative to public reassignment and eventual internal termination. This was the hook. Renwick knew the game. This was the moment the institution exchanged formal punishment for deniable utility. They couldn't execute him. It would confirm the severity of the incident. They couldn't let him remain in the chain of command. He knew too much. An alternative assignment? Renwick asked, his voice now dry and heavy. Black Op. Deniable assets only. We have identified a critical vulnerability exposed by the recent energy fluctuation, something the, intruders may have been attempting to locate or assess during their brief appearance. The Zydran hadn't retreated because they were scared of bad paperwork. They had retreated because the administrative chaos had momentarily obscured their true objective, forcing them to regroup and reassess the data Kalen Rourke had inadvertently provided them. The efficiency of the Zydran meant every action was deliberate. If they were looking for something, it was far more dangerous than Namara Station itself. We have reason to believe, Durnathar lowered her voice, the first hint of non-institutional concern entering her tone, that the energy surge, specifically transmitted through that low-frequency beta channel, momentarily resonated with a heavily shielded, pre-colonial archival storage facility on the fringe of the Gethsemane Belt. Location designation, Sector 090. Renwick felt a sudden sharp coldness settle in his chest, deeper than the room's chilling air. Sector 090. That was deep space, ancient territory, rumored to hold the remnants of the First Contact Wars, pre-hyperdrive hardware, theoretical weapons systems locked away centuries ago because they were too dangerous, too inefficient, or too controversial to use. The Gethsemane Belt is quarantined, adjudicator, Renwick pointed out. We haven't had a vessel authorized to breach the 500-meter exclusion zone in 200 standard years. Precisely why this is an unlogged assignment, Durnathar confirmed. You are to take a single short-range interceptor, the Acheron, loaded with minimal life support and maximal kinetic ordnance. Proceed to 090, penetrate the archival facility, retrieve asset designation, Chimera, and return it to this sector for analysis, or destroy it if retrieval is compromised. You will receive no support. You will transmit no logs. If you are successful, your record will be purged of the misconduct and replaced with heroic sacrifice in the line of duty, allowing your family full entitlements. Renwick understood the implication. If he failed, he was a derelict officer who died attempting an unauthorized deep space journey. If he succeeded, he was a dead hero whose secrets would be buried forever. The system did not want him alive, but it desperately needed the asset the Zydron had accidentally glimpsed. He looked down at the smooth, reflective surface of the steel table, catching a fragmented reflection of his tired 40-something face. 6 cycles of slow, bureaucratic decay, followed by a 4.7-second flash of truth. And now the entire defense architecture of the sector rested on retrieving a phantom weapon from a quarantine zone. The injustice was a tight knot of physical nausea in his gut. Dissensia biologica mingling with the metallic smell of defeat. Kalen Rourke had exposed the threat by exploiting human sloppiness. Renwick Halver was now being punished for that success and tasked with securing the weapon the aliens would surely return for. "And if I refuse?" Renwick asked, though he knew the answer. "You will be officially reprimanded and permanently relegated to cold maintenance oversight in the outer colonies," Durnethor said, without emotion. "A fate, Commander, I think you will find far less dignified than a quick death in the black." Renwick rose slowly, the stiff synthetic fibers of his uniform groaning under the movement. He didn't fight the system. He understood its cold, indifferent logic. Survival was based not on skill or strategy, but on administrative necessity. He looked out the panoramic viewport toward the distant, hazy blue sphere of the inhabited world below. He saw the vast, complex web of transit lines, power grids, and orbital defenses, all designed to protect a species that preferred comfortable lies to inconvenient truths. "I accept the assignment," Renwick Halvor confirmed, his voice now stripped down to institutional necessity. "Asset Chimera, Sector 090. The adjudicator offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "You depart in 1 standard hour, Commander. May the void prove less chaotic than our internal data structure." Renwick turned and walked toward the exit lock, the weight of the institution crushing his spirit, yet fueling a cold, strategic resolve. He wasn't aiming for justice anymore. Justice was an abstraction. He was aiming for survival, both his own and humanity's, knowing that the Zydron were not deterred by a few seconds of administrative static, but merely informed. They knew the weakness now, and they knew the location of something ancient and powerful. The perfect unseen enemy was not gone. It was just learning, and Renwick, dismissed and disgraced, was the only asset left outside the system's ability to compromise. The exit lock hissed open, an industrial sigh of stale, chilled air filtering into the sterile tribunal room. Renwick Halvor stepped through, not bothering to adjust his stride to the station's artificial gravity fluctuations, letting the slight, sickening lurch remind him that his body was still anchored to the slow collapse of the bureaucracy he had just left. The corridor outside was not the polished synth steel of the adjudicator's domain, but raw maintenance access, grey, perforated metal floors that amplified the sound of his heavy combat boots, and overhead lighting that flickered with a persistent, low-frequency hum. The air here smelled of burnt conduit insulation and lubricating oil, the honest stink of machinery pushed past its planned obsolescence. He walked fast, his knuckles white where he gripped the thin, laminated data slate Durnethar had handed him. It contained the coordinates and the barest operational parameters for Asset Chimera. Every step was a strategic withdrawal from the institutional lie. He needed to confirm the truth of the 2 visual arrays, Gamma and Pi. The official purge logs were impenetrable, but Renwick had served 22 years. He knew where the system hid its mistakes. Data wasn't destroyed, it was merely rerouted to the least accessed archival subnodes, categorized under headers designed to discourage review, usually decommissioned public works or historical weather patterns. Kalen Rourke, the auditor who triggered the crisis, would have appreciated the irony. Renwick reached the security hub, level Delta 4, a windowless concrete bunker originally designed to withstand kinetic impacts, but now mostly used as a break room. He bypassed the main console, ignoring the two junior technicians playing a noisy simulation game, and headed straight for a deprecated auxiliary terminal built into the wall behind a rack of dusty cleaning supplies. He thumbed in his old command codes. The terminal recognized the clearance, but flashed a bright, furious red warning. Access attempt denied. User clearance level 47B suspended. Reason: administrative misconduct. Logging initiated. He typed faster, overriding the automated log initiation with a sequence of legacy fleet protocols he hadn't used since his academy days, exploiting a loophole he had personally flagged as a security risk 15 years prior, only to have it shelved as low priority. The system paused, then spat back a single cold line. Manual override rejected. Administrative hold initiated by adjudicator Durnathar, SAC 99 Lambda. Durnathar had anticipated his move. She hadn't just stripped his rank, she had isolated him from the information structure he was sworn to protect. The system had locked him out, rendering him functionally blind. His heart, which had been steady throughout the tribunal, gave a heavy, sickening beat against his ribs. The pressure in his head returned, but this time it was purely frustration, the kind of corrosive anger that eats at strategic clarity. He needed to know what the Zydran had seen. What was so important about Sector 090? He slammed his fist against the terminal's synth steel casing. The two technicians in the break room looked up, startled, then quickly averted their gazes, returning to the loud, rhythmic noise of their simulation, a familiar display of institutional avoidance. "Get me a line to Quartermaster Delta," Renwick ordered, his voice echoing in the small room, flat and demanding. One technician, a thin man with tired eyes, fumbled for his comms unit. "Commander Halver, sir, your access might be—" "I am on assignment," Renwick cut in, letting the official weight of the lie settle. "Priority 090. Log it as equipment requisition. I need the Acheron prepped and ready for departure in 30 minutes, not 1 standard hour." The technician, relieved to be given a task that didn't involve questioning authority, scrambled to comply. Renwick stood by the terminal, breathing deeply, trying to wash away the smell of dust and burnt electronics. The Acheron, a single-seat interceptor designed for speed and short, brutal engagements, not deep space quarantine breaches. It was the perfect vessel for a deniable asset, fast, small, and utterly expendable. He leaned his forehead against the cold metal casing of the dead terminal. For 20 years, he had operated under the assumption that the chain of command was fundamentally rational, driven by survival and logistics. Now, he saw the truth. The institution was a self-sustaining organism dedicated only to its own continuity. The Zydran threat was secondary to maintaining the myth of CDA competence. We attribute the detection of a potential hostile invasion force to a random 300-year-old coffee dispenser relay. He remembered his father, a low-level maintenance worker who spent 40 years servicing orbital cooling pumps. His father often said, "The biggest risks aren't the things that break, Renwick. They're the things that stay working long after they should have been replaced, holding up something massive with a thread of cheap wiring." Kalen Rourke had found that wire, and now Renwick was paying the debt. The comms unit buzzed. "Commander Halvor, Quartermaster Delta is on the line, but he's requesting confirmation of the ordnance loadout." Renwick took the unit. Halvor here. What is the issue, Quartermaster? The Quartermaster's voice was dry, professional, and slightly incredulous. Commander, the manifest calls for maximum kinetic ordnance. We're talking depleted uranium scatter-rounds, non-guided. That's a massive payload for an interceptor. Are you sure you don't want phased plasma? I want kinetic, Renwick confirmed, the word sharp. Sir, kinetic ordnance is useless against shielded targets. The Acheron is meant for pursuit and interdiction, not siege warfare. Are we expecting ground suppression? Renwick paused. Durnathar's instructions had been explicit. Retrieve asset designation, Chimera, and return it to this sector for analysis, or destroy it if retrieval is compromised. To destroy something ancient and heavily shielded in a quarantine zone required tremendous brute force, not surgical strikes. Plasma dispersed, kinetic penetrated. He realized what Asset Chimera likely was. Not a theoretical weapon system, but physical pre-colonial architecture. Something built before humanity understood cloaking or energy shielding. Something dense and heavy that the Zydran logic bomb had accidentally tickled. I need mass, Renwick instructed, his voice low. Kinetic rounds, maximum density, and 3 thermal charges. 5 kilotons per charge. Deliver them directly to Bay 9. No logging beyond the standard manifest. A short, weighted silence followed. 5 kilotons of thermal charges were designed for planetary quarantine to ensure nothing survived contact. It was overkill for anything short of sterilizing an entire moon. Understood, Commander, the Quartermaster finally replied. The fear in his tone now replaced by cold obedience. 090 loadout initiated, but sir, the civilian mechanic assigned to Bay 9 has also just initiated docking procedures. She's demanding full access to the Acheron's navigation array for calibration and structural integrity review. Says she was specifically requested by adjudicator Durnathar. Renwick felt a cold tremor. Durnathar had sealed the information channels, loaded him with an impossible terminal mission, and now placed a handler on his vessel. She wasn't just observing him, she was controlling the outcome. Who is the civilian? Renwick demanded. Coris Wynn, Commander. Stellar Auditing Corps, technical support. She just arrived from the interior sector. Looks like she brought her own tool crate. Coris Wynn. Another auditor. Durnathar was not trusting Renwick to fail gracefully. She was ensuring he would fail with adherence to protocol. Guaranteeing Asset Chimera was either retrieved or eliminated. Renwick understood instantly. Coris Wynn was his institutional executioner, deployed to guarantee no non-CDA data was retrieved from Sector 090, and to enforce the destruction protocol if retrieval was compromised. Confirming, Renwick said, accepting the bitter pill. Coris Wynn has authorization. Ensure her access is complete. And Quartermaster, put a heavy-duty containment seal on that terminal you used. Wipe all local memory logs of this conversation. Consider it a Level 5 security breach if those details leak. Wiping logs now, Commander. Renwick disconnected the unit. He was compromised, shadowed, and loaded onto a suicide mission with an institutional watchdog. The injustice was no longer a philosophical concept. It was a physical chain around his neck. He looked at the small data slate containing the coordinates. Sector 090. He was going in blind, facing a threat the system refused to acknowledge, carrying a weapon designed to solve problems by erasing them completely, and sharing the confined space of the Acheron with an auditor trained to report procedural deviations. He was disposable. But if Asset Chimera was what the Zydran were truly after, then sacrificing himself to secure it or destroy it was the only remaining purpose he had. He walked toward Bay 9, the heavy metallic smell of the lower decks now mingling with the scent of ozone and the subtle, sharp tang of pure tactical necessity. He needed to assess Corys Wynn, calculate her obedience threshold, and determine if she was the final piece of his assignment or merely the first obstacle to survival. He had 30 minutes before liftoff. The perfect unseen enemy was learning, and Renwick, in his final doomed mission, needed to learn faster. Renwick hit the pressurized access ramp leading to Bay 9. The heat was immediate, not the regulated warmth of the station's main levels, but the localized metallic heat of 3 docking cranes operating under maximum load. The air was heavy with the sharp smell of hydraulic fluid and the hot insulating plastic of high-amp power cables. The Acheron sat anchored, its matte black hull blending into the shadows. Corys Wynn was already there, a small, precise figure in a sterile white jumpsuit, hunched over a diagnostics port near the nose cone, her back to him. Before acknowledging her, Renwick slipped into the narrow utility passage behind the docking cradle. He needed those visual logs. He pulled a specialized interface chip from a hidden pocket, unlogged 20-year-old tech. He connected it directly to a low-level diagnostic bus beneath the Acheron's primary sensor array, bypassing the main firewalls entirely. This bus usually contained only redundant flight telemetry, but sometimes, during rapid purges, critical data was dumped there as miscellaneous overflow before final erasure. He waited for the signal. The chip hummed, generating a faint, high-pitched whine that tasted of raw, unstable energy. There, a packet transfer initiated. The header read, Gamma Array Lensing Artifacts. He had it. Then, the chip screamed. A massive voltage spike, localized and deliberate, surged back through the bus. Not an accidental overload, an electronic countermeasure. Renwick snatched his hand back, the synthetic glove fusing instantly to the chip. The electrical shock raced up his arm, contracting the muscle in his forearm into a rigid knot of agonizing pain. He dropped the useless chip. Renwick stumbled back into the open bay, nursing his throbbing arm. Corys Wynn turned slowly, holding a specialized probe in her hand. Her face, framed by severe, pulled-back hair, showed no surprise, only the cold, distant focus of someone observing a malfunction. "Commander Halvor," she stated, her voice calm and lacking cadence, "attempting unauthorized access to proprietary diagnostics. Level 4 violation, sir. Durnathar's restrictions are absolute. You knew I would try." Renwick grated out, flexing his useless left hand. The smell of ozone and burnt carbon hung in the air, a physical pressure in his sinuses. "I know the difference between operational necessity and institutional denial," Corys countered, replacing the probe carefully in her crate. "My function is to ensure Asset Chimera is handled according to protocol. That includes ensuring the retrieval vessel is not contaminated by irrelevant, volatile data." Renwick swallowed the pain, forcing the muscle to relax. "What is Chimera? We are carrying 5 kilotons of thermal charges to destroy something we don't understand." Corys walked toward the boarding ramp, her movements economical and precise. "Asset Chimera is not a weapon system, Commander. It is a spatial anchor. Pre-colonial, designed to lock a specific sector of real space out of the warp bubble transit lanes. It was decommissioned because it required too much energy and, crucially, because it worked too well. If the Zydron detected its low-frequency signature during Kalen Rourke's administrative panic, they know that 090 is the only spot in this sector they cannot access instantly via their temporal cloak drive." Renwick felt a chill override the metallic heat of the bay. They weren't after a weapon. They were after a logistical key. They wanted to neutralize the anchor so they could flood the sector undetected. Why the kinetic ordnance? Because destroying a spatial anchor requires fracturing its physical matrix, not vaporizing it, Corys explained, climbing the ladder into the cockpit. The kinetic mass is necessary to break the casing. The thermal charges are for sterilization if retrieval is impossible. She paused, turning to him as he reached the top of the ramp. "Durnathar has one goal. If we can't bring the anchor back, We destroy the anchor, ensuring 090 becomes just another chaotic warp route the Zydran can exploit. That is strategically preferable to allowing them to control it. She tossed a small, heavy slate down to him. It was a fragment of pre-colonial architecture schematics, heavily corrupted. The surface felt greasy, almost vibrating with captured energy. The anchor is protected by a secondary field. It's keyed to the unique resonant frequency of the pre-colonial warp engine design, a sequence we lost centuries ago. But the data stream Kalen Rourke generated, it wasn't just noise, it contained accidental low-band harmonics, a ghost frequency. I've isolated it. It is the key to bypassing the anchor's secondary shielding. So you're saying the chaos we spent 22 years trying to eliminate is now the only key to saving us? Renwick asked, examining the chaotic, pulsing mathematics on the slate. Human entropy is our most powerful defense, Commander. We weaponize our failings. Corris secured herself in the co-pilot seat. However, the sequence is volatile. Routing it through the Acheron's primary system will burn out our navigation array immediately, leaving us adrift in 090. That is the complicating factor. Renwick settled into the pilot's cradle, his right hand automatically seeking the primary controls. The air in the cockpit was close, smelling of synthetic leather and Corris's faint, metallic perfume. If we lose navigation, we become a kinetic projectile without guidance, Renwick noted, running the pre-flight checklist. The list was meaningless. The mission was already a failure state masquerading as a deployment. The Acheron has basic manual control, Corris replied, checking her own auxiliary restraints. Enough for atmospheric insertion, perhaps. Not enough for high-speed interstellar transit or precise evasion. If we use the sequence to breach the anchor's defenses, we have precisely 90 seconds before the residual energy spike destroys the system, 90 seconds to secure Asset Chimera or plant the thermal charges. The choice was stark: institutional self-preservation or tactical victory followed by certain abandonment. If they preserved the ship, they failed Dernithar's mandate, and the Zydran would win the strategic location. If they completed the mission, they would likely die in the quarantine zone, but the sector would remain protected. Renwick looked down at his arm, the dark purple bruise blooming where the electrical countermeasure hit him. He had already sacrificed his integrity, his career, and now his body. The only thing left to sacrifice was his survival. "Initiate the jump sequence," Renwick commanded. "Route the ghost frequency through the primary array during the warp initiation cycle. Prepare for maximum system drain and catastrophic hardware failure." Corris nodded, a flicker of something like respect crossing her pale features. "Affirmative, Commander. Commencing jump in 300 standard ticks." The Acheron shuddered as the massive drive coils powered up. The ambient electrical noise in the cockpit escalated into a physical pressure, vibrating the bones in Renwick's skull. As the count reached 40, Corris initiated the volatile sequence. The small ship did not glide into the warp. It was slammed into it. The transition was agonizing. The chaotic, uncontrolled frequency amplified the usual nauseating distortion of hyperdrive transit by 10 times. Lights flickered out. Smoke, thick and chemically sweet, poured from the navigation console. Renwick fought the controls, trying to maintain the vessel's vector, but the ship was momentarily possessed by the chaos. His left arm flared again, the damaged nerves screaming in protest against the raw, uncontrolled power surging around him. The stench of burning insulation and the metallic tang of fear saturated the air. Warp exit in T-10 cycles. The ship dropped out of transit, not with a smooth decompression, but a violent, whipping shockwave that slammed Renwick against his restraints. The inertia compensators failed instantly. The smell of burning insulation was overwhelming. Renwick gasped, fighting for air in the confined space. Silence. Absolute oppressive silence, broken only by the crackle of shorted wires and Renwick's ragged breathing. He coughed, clearing the smoke. "Status," he rasped, testing the controls. "Dead." Every navigational and long-range sensor was fried, displaying nothing but white noise. "Anchor location confirmed," Chorus reported, her voice strained but professional. 200 kilometers dead ahead. Visual confirmation. Asset Chimera is a structure, Commander. Massive pre-colonial shield architecture. It's absorbing localized gravity. Renwick peered through the primary viewport. Sector 090 was dark, heavy with dead stellar remnants and ancient orbital debris. In the center, a colossal monolithic structure, not built of curves or streamlined plating, but of blunt, heavy black stone-like material rotating slowly. It was the physical definition of inertia. "Zydran presence?" Renwick asked, ignoring the ache in his ribs. "Zero passive signals detected," Chorus confirmed. "They are cloaked, Commander, waiting for the frequency key to unlock the shield. They know we have it now." Renwick forced himself to manual steering, relying entirely on the visual feed. He was blind, floating toward an immovable object protected by an invisible enemy. He closed the gap quickly. Then Chorus's voice, for the first time, held true, unadulterated fear. "Commander, incoming transmission. Not Zydran, not human. It's an archaic protocol signature originating from Asset Chimera itself. Its shielding is down, but the structure is active. It's responding to the frequency key." "What is the content of the transmission?" Renwick demanded, gripping the dead flight stick. "It is not data, sir," Chorus whispered, staring wide-eyed at her auxiliary screen. "It is a command broadcast. It's radiating a directional pulse towards the nearest high-density object." A massive, secondary energy signature bloomed across the void, several hundred kilometers away. It was colossal, geometric, and perfectly visible. It was too late for cloaking. Whatever it wasn't hiding anymore. "That is not the Zydran scouting fleet," Renwick breathed, recognizing the terrifying scale. "That is a full mobilization dreadnought." "No, Commander," Chorus corrected, her voice brittle with realization. "The transmission from the anchor is instructing the dreadnought. We didn't just expose the anchor to the Zydran. We just activated Asset Chimera, and we pointed it at the nearest threat. And based on our kinetic signature and the chaos of our jump..." Renwick saw the dreadnought begin its inexorable turn, its main weapons bays glowing with pre-charge energy. The massive ship wasn't Zydran. It was ancient human fleet architecture, fully operational, woken from centuries of cold sleep by Kalen Rourke's administrative chaos and Corris Wynn's subsequent technical intervention. "We are now the nearest threat." The single surviving screen displayed a stark counter. Engagement protocol initiated. Time to impact, 35 seconds. Renwick was cornered between a self-aware, ancient defense system designed by humanity's most paranoid strategists and the invisible alien fleet waiting for the outcome. He had successfully delivered the key, but the lock had opened on his face. 35 seconds was not a countdown, it was the precise metric of failure. Renwick slammed his right fist down on the dead flight stick, ignoring the searing pain in his left forearm. He twisted violently in his harness to face Chorus, the air in the cramped cockpit thick and metallic with the smell of ozone and terror. "Chorus, that is not a defensive reaction, that is an execution order. Tell me what Dernathar didn't put on the data slate." Corris Wynn, pale in the flashing red emergency lights, was desperately trying to route power to the non-essential maneuvering thrusters. Her usual antiseptic calm had cracked, replaced by a desperate efficiency. "The Dreadnought is a Guardian-class system, Commander. It's a failsafe." Asset Chimera's primary function isn't just to block warp travel, it's to protect the integrity of the early colonial data, the records, the technology. If a vessel breaches the quarantine using an unstable pre-colonial frequency, the protocol identifies it as a compromised vector. A compromised vector? Renwick repeated, his voice dangerously low. The protocol dictates that anything unstable enough to generate the chaotic frequency surge, like our jump, must be neutralized immediately, before it can touch the anchor. Durnathar knew. She knew the ghost frequency would activate the Guardian, and she knew the Acheron, deliberately crippled by the jump, would be identified as the threat. The truth hit Renwick with the physical force of a kinetic impact. Durnathar hadn't sent him to retrieve the anchor. She had sent him to be the bait. He was not a deniable asset. He was a self-destruct mechanism, guaranteed to trigger the ancient Guardian, ensuring that if the Zydran were watching, they would witness the destruction of the key and retreat, leaving the institution safe behind its layers of lies. She sacrificed us to maintain the appearance of control, Renwick confirmed, the injustice solidifying into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. 14 seconds, Commander, Chorus screamed, pulling her head up from the smoking console. The dreadnought now filled the viewport, a city of black, angular synth steel and ancient, terrible purpose. Its main cannon bays glowed a sickly amber. Renwick looked past the dreadnought, into the darkness where the Zydran fleet was patiently waiting. They were masters of logic and efficiency. They wouldn't expose themselves to a functioning human defense system. They were simply letting humanity destroy its own vital asset, waiting for the smoke to clear before they moved in to analyze the debris and secure the area. He couldn't run. He couldn't hide. He couldn't complete the mission Durnathar had assigned him. The only viable path was to shatter the entire strategic landscape. "We are not the threat," Renwick stated, gripping the yoke. "The dreadnought is the threat. It's too powerful, too rigid. We have to disable it." "How, Commander? We have 12 seconds. Our kinetic rounds won't penetrate that hull. We only have manual thrust." Renwick engaged the maneuvering thrusters, sending the small ship into a clumsy, violent corkscrew. The G-forces pressed him deep into his seat, the metallic tang in his mouth turning to the sharp, bitter taste of adrenaline and blood. "We aren't attacking the hull," Renwick grunted, fighting the spin. "We are attacking the protocol. The Guardian is looking for compromise. We give it compromise on a scale it can't process." He glanced at the thermal charge detonation controls, the 5-kiloton payloads intended for the anchor. "Chorus, listen carefully. I need you to manually jettison the main kinetic payload on the far side of the anchor. Use the residual warp field signature as a marker, not toward the Guardian, but away from it. We create a false massive signal spike, something chaotic, something overwhelming." "A ghost signal decoy?" Chorus realized, her eyes wide with horrified understanding. "It's suicide, Renwick. That will draw every Zydran sensor, and the Guardian will prioritize the mass of the ordnance." "Exactly. It will split the Guardian's targeting algorithm. It will have to decide whether the chaotic energy spike or the physical mass of the ordnance is the primary vector of contamination. We overload its operational logic. It buys us 3 seconds. 3 seconds to do what? To hit the primary sensor array," Renwick replied, pulling the ship out of the spin and directly onto a collision course with the dreadnought's command spine. "We are expendable, Chorus, but we are not going to die for Durnathar's lie. We are going to die securing the sector." Chorus hesitated for a vital fraction of a second. She wasn't trained for martyrdom. She was trained for auditing. But the sight of the colossal, impersonal weapon bearing down on them, a weapon built by their own ancestors to enforce systemic purity, forced her hand. "Diverting power to jettison controls," Chorus stated, her voice returning to institutional drone, masking the profound ethical leap. 3 thermal charges armed, targeting the gravitational sink beyond the anchor, marked by residual frequency signature. T-8 seconds. Renwick pushed the manual thrusters to their maximum setting. The Acheron shook violently, its wounded systems screaming a high-pitched, failing chorus. "Jettison now!" Chorus slapped the controls. 3 massive kinetic payloads detached, rocketing toward the dark void beyond the anchor. Simultaneously, Renwick saw the Guardian dreadnought pause. The amber glow of its primary cannons dimmed. Chorus was right. The protocol was frozen, faced with 2 catastrophic, unresolvable threats: the ghost frequency spike of the ordnance and the direct trajectory of the Acheron. System conflict detected. Target priority recalculating. The text flashed red across the small auxiliary screen. 3 seconds, bot. Renwick breathed, sweat stinging his eyes. "Hold on, Chorus." He locked his gaze onto the dreadnought's primary targeting dish, a large, rotating aperture near the command bridge. It was the eye of the system, the most delicate piece of hardware. Renwick closed the gap, maneuvering the crippled Acheron with the desperate finesse of a man who had 20 years of practice but nothing left to lose. He used the final surge of momentum from the failing drive to propel them forward, a kinetic dart aimed at the heart of institutional cruelty. They hit. The impact was not the vaporization he expected, but a hideous grinding crunch of collapsing metal. The Acheron burrowed deep into the dreadnought's command spine, tearing through meters of reinforced plating. The airbags inflated instantly, slamming Renwick's chest and face with brutal force. The world went from red emergency light to blinding, static white noise. Renwick's senses swam in a chemical fog of discharged fire retardant, hot metal, and the sickeningly sweet smell of his own ruptured capillaries. When the ringing finally subsided, the only sound was the slow, rhythmic drip of leaking coolant and the ragged, shallow breathing of Chorus Wynn beside him. Renwick tried to move. His harness held him tight in the pilot's cradle, now tilted almost 90 degrees inside the wreckage. The viewport was a chaotic mosaic of crushed metal, but he could see through a gap. He was inside the dreadnought, stuck like a parasite in the sensor core. "Chorus. Status," he forced out, the words tasting like copper filings. Hull breach stabilized locally." Chorus coughed, shaking her head against the restraints. Her white jumpsuit was smeared with black hydraulic fluid and red blood. "We are stuck. The Guardian. It's blind. I think we ruptured the main targeting array." Renwick looked at the auxiliary screen. "Guardian system status. Critical logic overload. Threat vector eliminated." They had succeeded. They had neutralized the most immediate threat. Renwick felt a brief, profound exhaustion. The sweet exhaustion of having traded his life for a moment of strategic advantage. But the silence of the black space outside was wrong. Too quiet. If the dreadnought was disabled, the field was open. Renwick tried to reach the manual weapon controls, but his left arm refused to obey. He watched as the faint white noise on the primary sensor array, the dead navigation screen, began to resolve itself. Not into stars, but into shapes. Hundreds of them, geometric, heavy, and silent. The Zydron. They had seen the entire exchange. They had witnessed humanity's sophisticated defense system triggered by chaos, only to be destroyed by human self-sacrifice and institutional neglect. The system was now open. Chorus saw the incoming visual data display, her breath hitching in her throat. "Commander, they're decloaking. Full fleet mobilization. They waited for us to prove the area was clear of active defense." Renwick watched, helpless, as the enemy fleet materialized into sharp, cold reality. They were massive, more numerous than any intelligence estimate had ever suggested. They moved with the silent, terrible efficiency Kalen Rourke had observed in the energy logs. They didn't even acknowledge the wreckage of the Acheron or the disabled dreadnought. Their vector was locked. Their objective was Asset Chimera. And then, a new signal pulsed. A clear, logical coded transmission from the Zydran flagship. Axiom of efficiency, beamed directly to the disabled Guardian system, utilizing the same pre-colonial frequency Chorus had used. Chorus translated the data package instantly, her face draining of all color. Renwick, they didn't want to destroy the anchor. They wanted to analyze the frequency data when we used it. They know the key now, but they also just accessed the Guardian's operational protocols through the vulnerability we created. Renwick could hear the cold, triumphant logic in the Zydran communication, even without translating the text. The system designed by humanity's paranoia had been breached by humanity's self-destructive chaos. The Guardian dreadnought, despite its physical incapacitation, still possessed core computing power, and the Zydran were reprogramming its targeting priorities. They weren't fighting the Guardian, they were taking control of it. New primary target identified, Colonial Defense Authority Station Nomara. The dreadnought, its main cannon still functional, began to move sluggishly, turning its colossal bulk away from the anchor and toward the distant, soft blue light of the inhabited sector. The injustice was complete. Renwick had secured the anchor, but in doing so, he had handed the enemy a city-sized, fully armed warship pointed straight at the heart of the colony. The consequence of his desperate, irreversible decision was not heroic sacrifice, but total, strategic annihilation for millions who never even knew the threat existed. Chorus, Renwick whispered, the word thick with defeat. We just opened the gate. A single small Zydran scout vessel detached from the main fleet, approaching the exposed, fractured remains of the Acheron. It was not hostile, not firing. It was merely observing the wreckage, observing the flaw. The perfect, unseen enemy now had full visibility, and the deadliest weapon in the sector was under its command. Renwick stared into the vast, indifferent blackness, trapped between the colossal weapon he had unleashed and the logical aliens who had effortlessly weaponized human failure. He felt the cold vacuum of the realization settle deep in his bones. Humanity had not been saved by its auditors or its soldiers. It had merely been leveraged. The cold vacuum of that realization did not kill him. Instead, it magnified the pain. The dull, constant throb in his chest from the airbag impact, the burning agony in his left arm, and the nauseating pressure building behind his eyes. He was alive, but only to witness the definitive consequence of his tactical gamble. The Zydran scout vessel, silent and geometrically precise, drifted closer, its observation ports reflecting the emergency red lights spilling from the wrecked Acheron. It was an act of profound, silent contempt. They were examining the wreckage not as a threat overcome, but as a scientific specimen. Renwick strained against the restraints, his right hand gripping the jagged edge of a broken control panel. He looked at Chorus Wynn. She was conscious, but barely, her breathing shallow and ragged. She was staring at the auxiliary screen, which was now filled with continuous, scrolling Zydran command code. The systematic subjugation of the Guardian dreadnought's core functions. They're routing the navigation through their flagship, Chorus croaked, the words tasting like pulverized metal. They don't need to cloak the Guardian. It's too large. They just need to control its vector. They're using it as an armored fist to smash Nomara Station. Renwick closed his eyes, accepting the scale of the defeat. The institution, in its desperation to bury an inconvenient truth, had created the perfect weapon for the enemy. And Renwick, in his determination to circumvent the administrative lie, had delivered it. The Zydran hadn't had to fire a single plasma round at the human defense infrastructure. Humanity had provided the kinetic solution itself. The thermal charges, Renwick whispered, forcing his mind to retrieve data from the chaos. We jettisoned the thermal charges, 3 5-kiloton payloads. They are still active. They were aimed away from the anchor, toward the dark region of the void. Chorus shifted, wincing, and struggled to access the jettison log on her remaining functional auxiliary slate. Confirmed. They are coasting on residual momentum. Estimated drift zone. Far side of the anchor, approximately 50 kilometers beyond the original exclusion field. The Zydron will ignore them. They are only focused on the anchor and the Guardian. The kinetic ordnance, designed to destroy the anchor, had become a pointless decoy. Yet they remained an existential threat, not to the Zydron, but to the sector. 5 kilotons of thermal destruction, floating unmonitored in a high-traffic area. If those charges were remotely triggered by stray debris or background radiation, the ensuing gravitational wave would destroy the compromised systems of the anchor, instantly opening the sector to the remaining Zydron fleet. It was a technicality of failure, a disastrous loose end. Renwick felt the metallic pressure of his exhaustion, the fatiga industrial of a body that had reached its limits. Why bother? Why not simply allow the Zydron scout to finish the job? The system he defended had betrayed him. His sacrifice had been counterproductive, and the consequence was the death of millions. He had only confirmed Kalen Rourke's original assessment. The fatal flaw of humanity was not its capacity for chaos, but its unwavering dedication to the most destructive form of institutional inertia. He looked at the approaching scout vessel again. It was small, fast, and silent. He admitted the weakness. In the 4.7 seconds of the administrative panic, when he pulled the Acheron into the collision course, he wasn't thinking about strategy or survival. He was thinking only about delivering one final, violent act of defiance against Adjudicator Dernithar, proving that his life had purpose beyond institutional discard. It was an act of selfish administrative rage, and now the payment was due. A high-pitched, insistent whine began to resonate through the wreckage, the paranoia electrica of localized monitoring. The Zydron scout had begun to interface with the disabled Acheron. "They're looking for data logs, Renwick," Chorus said, her voice strained. "They want the details of how we breached the Guardian's protocol. They want the ghost frequency. They were not just conquering, they were learning. They were perfecting their strategy based on human error." The scout vessel's physical presence intensified the electronic surveillance. Renwick could feel the subtle energy pulses of the Zydron attempting to map the Acheron's surviving internal network. But the Zydron, masters of pure logic, would be using standard, optimized protocols for data extraction. They wouldn't anticipate the layers of human sloppiness built into the vessel. The main drive of the Guardian dreadnought pulsed, beginning its agonizingly slow turn toward Namara Station. Renwick had perhaps 10 minutes before the Zydron consolidated their control and began to move the warship away from the quarantine zone. Renwick forced himself to lift his damaged left arm. The pain was blinding, white-hot, but he needed the dexterity. "Chorus, listen. The Zydron have breached the Acheron's auxiliary processing unit, but they won't be looking for our maintenance diagnostics. They only care about the frequency data." "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting we utilize the one thing they cannot compute: catastrophic, unscheduled entropy." Renwick muttered, his breath hitching. "When I slammed the deprecated interface chip into the diagnostic bus in Bay 9, you hit it with an electronic countermeasure. That surge didn't just burn out the chip in my arm. It cooked the backup diagnostic storage node, turning it into a chaotic data sink." Chorus understood instantly. "You think there's residual power in that sink? Enough to transmit a signal?" "No, it's not enough to transmit a signal, but it might be enough to transmit noise, specifically administrative noise. The original data Kalen Rourke logged, the massive, pointless flood of non-essential lighting power. If we can route the Guardian's current pre-colonial frequency through that data sink, It will corrupt the Zydran's access protocol with Kalen's pure, distilled, bureaucratic nonsense. Chorus shook her head slowly, disbelieving the desperate technical absurdity. That's technical suicide, Renwick. If they catch even a fraction of that chaos, they'll vaporize us instantly for systemic contamination. We're already vaporized, Chorus. We are stuck in the sensor core of a dreadnought aimed at our home world. We have nothing left to lose but the satisfaction of letting them win cleanly. Renwick began working the tertiary console with his right hand, ignoring the spray of sparks from the shorted panel beside his head. He was looking for the ancient, secondary manual routing circuit for the Acheron's backup short-range comms, a system designed for sending localized repair requests, not tactical transmissions. I need you to confirm the Zydran interface protocol, Renwick instructed. They are using their own highly optimized data compression. Find the gap, the logical space where the efficiency becomes a vulnerability. Chorus, driven by the cold institutional fear that superseded physical pain, focused on the auxiliary slate. Found it. They are prioritizing bandwidth for the Guardian's main thruster relay. They are leaving an unprotected gap, a small 5-millisecond window every 4 cycles, to ensure system efficiency is maintained during core data transfer. 5 milliseconds. It wasn't enough time to transmit a warning or a strategy, but it was enough time to transmit a fatal dose of pure, unadulterated human chaos. Renwick located the physical override for the backup comms relay, a thick metal lever hidden behind the charred pilot seat. He had to use both hands, one good, one searingly injured, to pull it into place. The effort made him gasp, the taste of bile rising in his throat. I've rerouted the line. Get ready to initiate the frequency flood. Aim for that 5-millisecond window. Chorus, this isn't about destroying the Zydran. This is about making them pause, making them think their flawless logic has failed them. He looked out the viewport. The Zydron scout was hovering 20 meters away, its instruments silently scanning. The massive Guardian dreadnought was beginning its slow, dreadful transit. Chorus nodded, her eyes fierce despite the blood staining her jaw. She was no soldier, but she understood the imperative of data integrity. And the Zydran were violating the data integrity of a human system. Ready on my mark, Commander, targeting 4 cycles from now. They will detect the external energy spike the moment it hits their interface node. Renwick took a deep, shuddering breath of the chemical-laced air. He was a discredited commander, trapped in the wreckage of a failed mission, about to commit an act of digital terrorism that would confirm all the fears of the institutional elite and likely result in his immediate death. But the thought brought a strange, heavy sense of peace. He was doing it on his own terms. Mark, Renwick commanded. Chorus slammed the transfer key. The immediate result was not an explosion, but a sudden, violent silence. The high-pitched whine of the Zydran surveillance instantly cut out. The emergency lights in the Acheron flickered violently, then went dark, plunged into absolute blackness. A second later, the darkness was shattered by a cascade of hostile alarms throughout the Zydran fleet. Not the organized, logical alarms of a military engagement, but the chaotic, systemic screams of a structure failing under incomprehensible stress. The dreadnought's propulsion system stuttered, emitting a colossal, discordant electrical surge that pulsed across the void. The Zydran had caught the chaos. Renwick, now operating in total darkness, could hear the rapid, escalating static in his comms unit, the sound of Zydran emergency 6 heavy hydraulic clamps. "The clamps are powered by the Guardian's local grid," Renwick muttered, leaning against the cold metal. "If the Zydran are isolating the core, they might have cut local power access to non-essential systems like this." He pulled a small multi-tool from his belt, a relic of his auditing days, the weapon of choice for administrative warfare. He accessed the emergency manual release panel beside the hatch. It was old, built on robust analog systems the Zydran likely deemed too primitive to compromise. He inserted the tool. The panel sputtered violently, a burst of red sparks, paranoia electrica, confirming the Zydran had applied a massive voltage spike to all external access points, intending to fry any potential intruder attempting escape. "They anticipated physical exfiltration," Renwick gasped, pulling his hand back, the multi-tool smoking. "They sealed the asset." "There must be a localized auxiliary power core nearby," Corus whispered, clutching her side. "Something the Zydran overlooked because it violates their logic of efficient redundancy." Renwick thought of Kalen Rourke, the despised auditor whose administrative pettiness had saved the sector. Kalen's success lay in identifying and exploiting human sloppiness, the 300-year-old coffee dispenser relay. Renwick needed the equivalent structural flaw here. He looked up. Directly above the heavy maintenance hatch, tucked into the dark angle where the hull plating met the conduit access, was a small, dusty plaque. "Emergency Backup Lighting Bus, ZR9. Authorized access only." "Emergency lighting," Renwick said, a dry, weary laugh escaping his lips. 300 meters of cable running off a tertiary battery designed to prevent janitors from tripping in the dark. The Zydran, obsessed with the main power core and the ghost frequency data, would have ignored the trivial energy source required to illuminate a maintenance pathway. Renwick managed to climb a meter up the wall, the effort nearly causing him to black out. He found the access panel for the emergency lighting bus. It was sealed with 8 corroded screws. He worked the tool, his good arm shaking with effort, fighting the structural integrity designed centuries ago. After what felt like an hour, the panel groaned open, revealing thick, dusty wires leading to a compact battery cell. "Corus, give me the primary interface cable from your harness." She struggled, handing him the thick, multi-strand data cable. Renwick looked at the cable, then at the low-voltage, heavily shielded terminals of the emergency lighting bus. He was about to perform the ultimate act of operational absurdity, routing the low-wattage energy designed for 6 light bulbs into the high-amperage hydraulic release mechanism of a 7-ton door. It was guaranteed to fail, or worse, cause a disastrous surge that would weld the door shut permanently, but it was the only power source available. He stripped the protective shielding from the emergency lighting wires with his teeth, tasting metal and ozone. He exposed the terminals, then jammed the primary interface cable, designed for data transfer, not current, into the fraying lighting wires. He felt the minute trickle of power bleed into the cable. He crawled back down to the main manual release panel, bypassing the fried electronics and connecting the power cable directly to the analog hydraulic pump's input manifold. He stood back, bracing himself. He had provided a trickle of useless energy to a system designed to handle a flood. He flipped the auxiliary switch on the manifold. Instead of a surge or a clean activation, there was a terrible grinding sound of forced hydraulics. The lights inside the shaft flickered violently, the emergency bus protesting the impossible demand. The door shuddered, but the clamps remained locked. Renwick slammed his fist against the cold metal casing of the pump. "Come on, you ancient piece of junk, be inefficient." He waited, listening to the agonizing, strained hydraulic whine. The pump was trying to function on 0.5% of its required voltage, turning the powerful clamps with glacial slowness, like a dying animal dragging itself across the void. Suddenly, one clamp snapped open, then a second. The system hadn't failed entirely. It was simply operating at an intolerably low level of performance. "It's working," Chorus whispered, tears visible in her helmet's residual condensation. "It's working because of its own inefficiency." The Zydran, had they known, would have calculated the time required for such an operation and assumed the effort was irrational. But irrationality was the only resource Renwick had left. The process took 15 minutes. 15 minutes of agonizing slow releases, accompanied by the ceaseless, internal thrum of the dreadnought moving toward its own calculated point of execution. Finally, the last clamp released with a heavy, final thunk. The door was free, but the pressure differential kept it sealed. "We are through," Renwick coughed, spitting blood. "But we need to find the exit before the Zydran realize we weren't vaporized." He managed to pry the heavy hatch open just enough to reveal the deep darkness beyond. The conduit led to the maintenance catacombs of the dreadnought's core, a confusing labyrinth of pipes and shielding. Renwick helped Chorus through the aperture. As she passed, she looked up at him, her eyes wide with a cold, desperate fear. "Renwick, the Guardian systems have stabilized. They filtered the noise. Estimated Zydran cleansing sweep arrival. 12 minutes. 12 minutes." They were now inside the massive, failing shell of the Guardian, moving through the internal darkness of the enemy's final asset. Renwick knew the Zydran would not send a scout this time. They would send an automated system designed for contaminant disposal, a precise, logical instrument designed to vaporize all trace of human interference. Renwick looked back at the emergency lighting panel, now dark, the tertiary battery having died in the effort to open the door. He felt the heavy, desolate silence of the giant ship consuming them. He had won the battle of paperwork and secured the destruction of the evidence, but he was trapped, alone, wounded, and moving inexorably toward a zero-sum conclusion. He shifted his weight onto his good leg, guiding Chorus deeper into the shadows of the ancient dreadnought. He was still the custodian of a forgotten secret, but now he was also a ghost, moving through the enemy's graveyard. The institutional war was over, but the fight for basic, ugly survival had just begun. He was inside the machine, and the machine was dying. The air in the maintenance catacombs was cold and thick, smelling of old lubricating oil, rust, and the fainter, sharp scent of ozone leaking from damaged wiring. The 12 minutes was not a clock ticking down. It was a vast, strategic silence settling over the battlefield. They reached a nexus point, a heavily shielded alcove where the primary coolant lines met the reactor housing. The ambient temperature here was marginally higher, enough to slow the creeping chill of the environment and the dissensia biologica of their failing suits. Renwick slid down against a massive segmented pipe, the metal clammy beneath his fractured left arm. Chorus sank beside him, her breathing ragged, eyes distant. The high-pitched ringing in Renwick's ears had faded slightly, replaced by the profound, heavy thrum of the dreadnought's primary reactor, the sound echoing through the kilometers of hull plating, the heartbeat of a dying starship. "We stopped the scout," Renwick managed, the effort of speech drawing blood into his throat. Chorus nodded slowly, pressing a hand against her abdomen. "And we destroyed the Acheron and the asset Chimera. Everything points to administrative success, Commander. Zero evidence of an unauthorized extraction, zero evidence of hostile technology breaching the Nomara sector. The data trail ends here." "The mission was flawed from the jump," Renwick corrected, shifting his weight. He felt the dull, internal throb of potential organ damage, a cold, sickening reminder that the systemic failure wasn't just administrative, it was physical, biological. The adjudicator needed the asset. Now they get nothing but a clean subtraction. "The clean subtraction is what they truly value," Chorus said, a trace of bitter lucidity in her voice. The Zydran are cleansing the Guardian to restore their integrity. Our people are cleansing the logs to restore theirs." They were silent for a long moment, listening to the ship glide through the vacuum toward its calculated end. Renwick looked at the jagged scar running across the synth steel pipe beside him, a flaw in the ancient manufacture, a microscopic imperfection that had survived centuries. "Kalen Rourke," Renwick mused aloud, his voice barely a whisper in the echoing chamber. "That obsolete relay. He proved that human error, entropy, was our greatest weapon against them. And now they understand that entropy must be quarantined," Corus finished. "We gave them the template for defense. Administrative purification." Renwick pulled his multi-tool from his belt. It was scarred, melted at the tip, useless for complex electronics, but still functioning as a simple lever, the weapon of administrative warfare. He set it on the cold floor plate beside him. "The cleansing sweep?" Renwick asked, his voice flat. "Is it kinetic or energy?" Corus swallowed hard. "Energy. Full-spectrum vaporization, highly localized, highly efficient, no collateral debris, a perfect subtraction, Commander. A perfect subtraction." The words echoed the cold, sterile intent of Sector Adjudicator Durnathar in the tribunal room, the necessity of bureaucratic neatness overriding inconvenient reality. They had started this campaign being administratively erased for incompetence. They were ending it being physically erased for necessity. The system had found its equilibrium. Renwick closed his eyes. The pressure differential behind his eyes had been a pain of pure, unadulterated injustice in that polished synth steel room. Now the pressure was internal, biological, the physical collapse of his 40-something frame. Fadiga Industrial had given way to total physiological exhaustion. He was not going back to the outer colonies, nor would he return to the hollow promise of heroic sacrifice in the line of duty. He was simply going to become noise filtered out of the operational logs. The ultimate ghost. He reached over and gently took Corus's hand.